Hey everyone, I'm Stories Arc, here to help you get some deep sleep tonight. Before we get started, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, get comfortable and relax. I should never have boarded the overnight train to Brasov. The decision felt small at the time, the kind of choice a traveler makes without ceremony. A cheap ticket, a narrow berth, the promise of a town that sits like a bruise against the Carpathians. I told myself I wanted to see the old hospital on the hill because I collect places that remember badly. I told myself I was curious, that curiosity was a profession, that I had earned the right to look. I told myself these things as the train eased out of Bucharest and the city lights thinned into a smear of distant stars. The carriage was nearly empty. A woman in a headscarf slept with her head against the window, her breath a slow, regular presence. A man in a suit read a newspaper with the kind of concentration that makes the rest of the world feel optional. I lay back on the narrow bed and watched the landscape move in a slow, indifferent slide. The hills rose and fell like the backs of sleeping animals. The air in the carriage smelled faintly of metal and old fabric, the kind of smell that belongs to places that have been used for a long time. I had read about the hospital in a forum thread that was mostly rumor and grief. It was a place that had been closed for decades, a psychiatric hospital that had been emptied during the last years of the regime, and then left to the weather. People wrote about rooms that kept their furniture as if the occupants had stepped out for a moment and never returned. They wrote about lights that stayed on in the windows when the rest of the town slept. They wrote about a nurse who walked the corridors with a lamp and a list, and about patients who left notes in the margins of books that no one read. I had come to see whether the place remembered the people who had lived there. When the train pulled into Brasov, the platform was a thin ribbon of light. The town smelled of wood smoke and wet stone. I walked to the bus stop and found a driver who spoke enough English to point me toward the road that climbed the hill. The bus wound upward, and the houses thinned until the town became a suggestion, and the trees took over. The hospital sat at the crest like a dark tooth, its silhouette broken against the sky. From the road it looked smaller than I had imagined, a cluster of low buildings with a taller wing that had once been a tower. The windows were mostly empty, their glass gone or clouded with grime. One window, on the second floor of the tower, held a light that did not belong to the night. I left the bus at the last stop and walked the rest of the way. The path to the hospital was a narrow lane of packed earth and gravel, bordered by a low stone wall that had been built by hands that knew how to make things last. The air smelled of damp leaves and the faint metallic tang of old plaster. My footsteps were the only deliberate motion. The town below was a scatter of lights, and the mountain beyond it was a darker, patient presence. The gate to the hospital was open. It hung from its hinges in a way that suggested the motion had been made long ago and then abandoned. I stepped through and felt the air change. The grounds were overgrown, grass pushing through cracks in the pavement, ivy climbing the walls like a slow, deliberate hand. The main building's facade was pitted and stained, but the architecture still held a dignity that the years had not entirely erased. A stone plaque near the entrance bore a name I could not pronounce without the language of the place folding around it. I moved toward the tower because the light in the window had become a question I could not ignore. The door at the base of the tower was unlocked. It opened inward with a motion that resisted and then yielded, and the threshold smelled of dust and old paper. Inside, the stairwell rose in a spiral, the steps worn smooth by feet that had passed this way for decades. I kept my flashlight off for a long time, letting my eyes adjust to the dim. The light in the window above was a steady, pale glow, not the flicker of a candle or the harshness of a modern bulb. It was the kind of light that suggests someone is awake and waiting. I climbed slowly. The stairwell had the geometry of a place that had been designed to contain movement, to make it deliberate. The plaster on the walls had hairline cracks that ran like veins. Old notices were tacked to a corkboard near a landing, their edges curled and their ink faded. I read a few lines of a typed memo that spoke of schedules and supplies, and a name that repeated like a small, private prayer. The higher I climbed, the more the air felt like a held breath. When I reached the second-floor landing, the corridor opened into a row of doors. The light in the tower window came from a room at the end of the hall. The door to that room was closed, but the light seeped around its edges like a patient thing. I stood in the corridor and listened to the building. There was no wind. There was no animal. The building made no sound that could be named. Instead, it held a kind of pressure, as if the walls themselves were waiting for a sentence to be finished. I pushed the door open and stepped into a room that had been arranged with a care that suggested someone had been interrupted. A bed sat against the far wall, its sheets folded with a precision that made the room feel like a stage set. A small table held a lamp, and the lamp's light was the source of the glow I had seen from outside. The lamp's shade was yellowed, and the bulb inside it cast a soft, even light that made the dust in the air visible as a slow, drifting film. On the table lay a stack of papers, a fountain pen with a cracked barrel, and a small leather-bound book. The room smelled of old linen and a faint medicinal scent that I could not place. I walked to the table and picked up the book. Its cover was worn, and the pages inside were filled with handwriting that moved from neat and careful to hurried and slanted, as if the writer had been losing the ability to steady their hand. The entries were dated, and the dates marched forward until they stopped abruptly. The last entry was recent enough that the ink had not fully settled into the paper. I read the last lines aloud because the room felt like a place that expected speech. The words were simple and precise. They described a light that would not go out, a nurse who kept the lamp lit because the patients were afraid of the dark, and a list of names that had been read aloud each night. The entry ended with a sentence that was not a sentence so much as a decision. The light will stay on until someone remembers us. I closed the book and felt the room tilt in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. The lamp's light seemed to thicken, as if the air itself had become more substantial. I set the book down and noticed, for the first time, that the bed across from the table had an indentation in the mattress, a shallow, precise hollow as if someone had been sitting there recently. The pillow was creased in a way that suggested a head had rested there not long ago. I told myself that the indentation was a trick of memory, that my mind, tired from travel, was inventing company. I told myself that the lamp had been left on by a caretaker who came at night to check the building. I told myself that the book was a relic, and that the last entry was a plea written by someone who had been lonely and frightened. I told myself these things because they were the only things I could tell myself. Then I heard the footsteps. They were not a sound that could be named. Instead, the floorboards registered a motion that moved from the corridor into the room. The motion was measured and deliberate, like someone who had practiced the act of walking in a place where every step mattered. I turned and saw a figure in the doorway, a woman in a uniform that had the faded authority of a nurse's dress. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was the kind of face that had been shaped by long nights and small mercies. She held a lamp in her hand, and the lamp's light was the same steady glow that filled the room. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes met mine with a look that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise. She moved into the room and set the lamp on the table with a motion that was careful and precise. The lamp's light pooled over the book and the papers, and the room seemed to exhale. "Are you lost?" she asked in English that carried the accent of the place. I told her I was a traveler, that I had come to see the hospital. I told her I had read about the light. She listened as if the words were a small private confession. When I finished, she sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap. The indentation in the mattress deepened, as if the bed remembered the weight of a body. She told me, without preamble, that the hospital had been closed for a long time. She told me that the patients had been moved and that some had been taken away in the night. She told me that the staff had left and that the building had been left to the weather. Her voice was steady, and the facts she offered were the kind of facts that do not need to be argued with. Then she said, "We keep the light on." I asked her why. She looked at the lamp and then at the window where the town below was a scatter of small, indifferent lights. "Because the light remembers," she said. "Because when the light is on, the rooms remember the people who lived in them. When the light goes out, the rooms forget." I thought she was speaking metaphorically, that she was offering a way to make sense of loss. I told her that memory is not a thing that can be kept by a bulb. She smiled in a way that was not unkind. "You are from far away," she said. "You do not know how a place can hold a life." She reached for the book and turned to a page near the end. Her finger traced a name and she said it aloud. The name was ordinary and precise. When she spoke it, the room seemed to lean in. I felt with a clarity that made my chest tighten that the name had weight in the air. She told me that sometimes people come back. She told me that sometimes the light brings them. She told me that sometimes the light keeps them here, in the way a photograph keeps a face. Her hands were steady on the book, and the lamp's light made the ink gleam. I asked her if she had been a nurse here. She nodded. She said she had stayed because someone had to keep the light on. She said that the lamp was not a machine but a promise. She said that promises are a kind of work. I asked her if she would let me leave. She looked at me as if the question had been asked before. "You can leave," she said, "but the light will follow you until you remember." I left the room because leaving felt like the only honest thing to do. The stairwell took me down in a slow, deliberate descent. The door at the base of the tower closed behind me with a motion that resisted and then yielded. Outside, the night had a clarity that made the hospital look like a thing that belonged to the world. The town below was a scatter of lights, and the mountain beyond it was a patient, indifferent presence. I walked back to the bus stop and sat on a bench that smelled of wet wood. The lamp's light in the tower window was a steady, pale glow. I thought of the book and the names and the nurse who kept the lamp lit. I thought of the way the room had felt like a stage set, as if the world had been arranged for a performance that had not yet finished. When I reached my hotel, I took the book from my bag. I had slipped it into my pack because I wanted to carry a piece of the place with me, because I wanted proof that I had been there. The book was warm from being handled. I opened it to the last page and read the final line again. "The light will stay on until someone remembers us." I do not know whether the nurse meant that the light would follow me in a literal way, or whether she meant that memory is a thing that travels with a person. I only know that when I turned out the hotel room light that night, I felt the absence of the hospital's lamp like a physical thing. I lay awake and thought of names, of faces, of the way a place can keep a life like a photograph keeps a face. In the morning, as I packed my bag, I noticed a small smear of dust on the book's cover. It was the shape of a hand. I do not know whose hand it was. I do not know whether the light will follow me. I only know that sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see the lamp's glow through the window of the tower, steady and patient, waiting for someone to remember. I should never have accepted the invitation to spend the night on a houseboat. The sentence sits in my mouth like a small stone, heavy and impossible to swallow. I say it now because saying it makes the memory feel less like a trap and more like a map. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own time, and Varanasi had been on my list for months. I wanted to see the river that people say remembers everything. I wanted to stand where the city meets the water and watch the world perform its rituals. I wanted to test whether a place could hold grief and prayer and the ordinary business of living in the same breath. The houseboat belonged to a man named Rafiq, who spoke English with a cadence that made his words feel like careful offerings. I met him at the Ghats just before dusk, when the light over the Ganges thinned into a color that was not quite gold and not quite gray. He had a small group of tourists with him, but when they left to join a boat with a guide who shouted and pointed, Rafiq looked at me and said, "You should come tonight. The river is different after dark." I told myself I was curious. I told myself I had come to Varanasi to see things that other people avoided. I told myself that a single night on the water would be a story worth carrying. I told myself these things as we stepped onto the narrow plank that led to his boat. and the city behind us folded into a line of lights. The houseboat was smaller than I had imagined. It was built of dark wood, varnished in places and weathered in others. A low roof arched over the cabin, and lanterns hung from the eaves, their glass clouded with age. The boat rocked gently against the current, not with the violent motion of a storm, but with the slow, patient movement of something that had been moving for a long time. The smell of the river was immediate, a mixture of algae and incense and the faint metallic tang of old iron. It settled into my clothes and into the lining of my thoughts. Rafik showed me the room I would sleep in. It was a narrow space with a low bed, a thin mattress, and a window that opened onto the river. He left a small lamp on the bedside table and told me he would be on the deck if I needed anything. He closed the door with a motion that suggested privacy and then stepped outside. The boat made a small adjustment in the water, as if it were settling into the night. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched the window. The river moved in a slow, deliberate slide. Boats passed at a distance, their lanterns like small, patient eyes. On the far bank, the ghats were a scatter of figures, some moving with purpose, others sitting and watching. The city made a sound that was not a sound so much as a texture, voices layered over one another, the occasional call of a vendor, the distant rhythm of a drum. It was a human noise that made the river feel like a stage. I had expected to sleep. Instead, I found myself awake and alert, as if the river had a way of keeping attention. I read a few pages of a book and then closed it because the words felt like intruders. I walked to the window and leaned my forehead against the cool glass. The reflection of my face looked like a photograph taken from a distance. Behind it, the river moved and the city performed its rituals. At some point, the boat's motion changed. It did not become rough. It simply shifted in a way that suggested someone had altered the course. The lanterns on the eaves dimmed, not because the bulbs had failed, but because the air itself seemed to thicken. I opened the door and stepped onto the deck. The night had a clarity that made the river look like a sheet of black glass. The ghats were farther away than they had been, and the city lights were a faint smear. Rafik was there, sitting on a low stool with his hands folded. He looked at me without surprise, as if he had expected me to come out. "The river is quiet tonight," he said. "It listens." I asked him if he had moved the boat. He smiled in a way that suggested the question was unnecessary. "The river moves us," he said. "Sometimes it takes us where we need to be." I did not press him. I had learned in my travels that some questions are better left to the places that hold the answers. I sat beside him and watched the water. The current was slow, and the surface of the river held reflections that were not quite reflections, faces and shapes that seemed to float just beneath the skin of the water. I told myself that my eyes were playing tricks, that the light and the movement and the fatigue of travel were conspiring to make the ordinary uncanny. Rafik reached into a small wooden box and took out a folded piece of cloth. He unfolded it with a care that made the motion feel like a ritual. The cloth was thin and worn, and when he held it up to the lantern light, I could see that it had been embroidered with a pattern of small, precise stitches. He placed the cloth on the deck and then, with a motion that was both deliberate and gentle, he set a small clay lamp on top of it. The lamp's flame was a steady, pale point that did not flicker. He told me that people sometimes left things on the river, offerings to the water that carried prayers and names. He said that the river kept them, that it remembered the hands that had made the offerings and the faces that had watched them float away. He spoke in a way that made the act of giving feel like a conversation between the living and the water. I watched the lamp as if it were a small sun. The flame's light made the cloth glow and the deck around it take on a soft, intimate quality. I felt for a moment like an intruder in a private ceremony. I told myself that I could leave, that I could step back into the cabin and close the door and let the night keep its secrets. Instead, I reached into my pocket and took out a photograph I had carried for reasons I could not fully explain. The photograph was of my father. It was a small, worn print with the edges softened by handling. He was younger in the picture, his smile a private thing. I had brought it because I had been thinking of him on this trip, because travel has a way of making absence feel like a presence. I placed the photograph on the cloth beside the lamp and felt the weight of the gesture in my chest. Rafik nodded as if he understood. He took a small stick and, with a motion that was careful and precise, he pushed the lamp and the photograph toward the edge of the deck. The current took them with a patient tug. The lamp floated for a moment, its light steady, and then the river accepted the offering and carried it away. The photograph turned in the water and then slipped beneath the surface, where the river's dark swallowed it like a mouth closing. I watched until the lamp and the photograph were gone. The act left a hollow in my chest that was not entirely sorrow. It was a recognition, a sense that something had been acknowledged. Rafik sat back on his stool and folded his hands. The river moved on. We sat in silence for a long time. The night had a density that made speech feel unnecessary. The boat's motion was a slow, patient rocking. The city on the bank continued its rituals, and the river kept its own counsel. I felt the presence of other things in the water, not threats but memories that had weight. I told myself that the river remembers everything because it has room for everything. When I returned to my room, I found the bed had been made with a precision that suggested someone had been there earlier. The pillow was creased in a way that suggested a head had rested there. I told myself that Rafik had prepared the bed before I arrived. I told myself that the river had not rearranged the boat for me. I told myself these things because they were the only things I could tell myself. I slept in fits and starts. Dreams came like fragments. A hand reaching from the water, a face that was both my father's and not my father's, a corridor of light that led to a door I could not open. I woke once and found the lamp on the bedside table burning with a steady, pale flame. The photograph was not on the table. I told myself that I had misplaced it, that the river had taken it, and that was the end of the story. At dawn, the boat was moored closer to the ghats. The city had returned to its daytime rhythm, and the river's surface was a sheet of moving light. I stepped onto the plank and felt the solidness of the earth under my feet. Rafik stood at the bow and looked at me with a look that was not quite farewell and not quite invitation. "Did you sleep?" he asked. I told him I had, in fits. He nodded as if he had expected that. He reached into his pocket and took out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to me without comment. The paper was damp at the edges, and when I unfolded it, I found a single line written in a hand that was careful and precise. "Remember what you leave." I looked at him and asked what he meant. He smiled in a way that made the lines at the corners of his eyes deepen. "The river keeps things," he said, "but sometimes it returns them in ways we do not expect." I thanked him and stepped onto the ghats. The city smelled of frying spices and the warm, clean scent of laundry. People moved with purpose. The river was a wide, patient presence. I walked away with the paper in my pocket and the memory of the lamp's light in my chest. That night, in a hotel room that smelled of detergent and the faint tang of the city, I took the photograph out of my bag. It was damp at the edges, and the image had a faint film over it, like a veil. I held it up to the light and saw, beneath the surface, a small smear that was not water and not ink. It was a mark that suggested something had touched the photograph in the water. I do not know whether the river returned the photograph or whether someone else found it and left a trace. I do not know whether the paper Rafik gave me was a warning or a benediction. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the lamp's flame and the way the river took the photograph and then, somehow, gave it back with a small, inscrutable alteration. I should never have accepted the invitation to spend the night on a houseboat. I did, and the river kept a piece of the moment. It returned something else in its place. I carry both with me, like two small stones in my pocket, and sometimes when I am alone, I take them out and try to remember which one belonged to the night and which one the river decided to keep. I should never have descended into the cistern after midnight. The sentence sits in my mouth like a coin I cannot swallow. I repeat it now because repetition is a small attempt at control, a way to measure the distance between what I chose and what chose me. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own memory, and Istanbul had been on my list for months, an old city folded into itself, where layers of history press against one another like pages in a book left open. I wanted to see the Basilica Cistern because everyone who writes about subterranean places mentions it with a kind of reverence. I wanted to stand where water and stone had learned to keep secrets. The entrance was unassuming, a narrow stairwell behind a small, dimly lit doorway near Sultanahmet. The ticket booth was closed when I arrived, the plaza above emptied of the daytime crowd. A security guard lingered by the gate, his posture the practiced stillness of someone who has watched the same scene repeat for years. He looked at me and, after a moment, nodded toward the stairwell. "After hours," he said in English that carried the city's cadence. "You can go down, but be careful." I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I had come to listen, not to disturb. I told myself that the cistern was a place that held memory, and that I would be a respectful guest. The stairwell smelled of damp stone and old oil. Each step down felt like moving through a throat. The air grew cooler, and the light thinned until the world above was a rumor. When the stairway opened into the cistern, the effect was immediate and total. The chamber was vast, a forest of columns rising from a shallow pool. The columns were arranged in rows that receded into darkness, their capitals carved with a variety of motifs. The water that covered the floor was black and still, reflecting the columns like a second inverted forest. Lanterns hung from the ceiling at intervals, their light soft and deliberate, making the water's surface look like a sheet of glass with small, patient ripples where the air moved. I walked along the raised walkway that threaded between the columns. My footsteps were the only deliberate motion. The air smelled of mineral and old stone and something else I could not name, a faint sweetness that seemed to belong to memory. The columns had a texture that was both rough and worn smooth in places where hands had touched them for centuries. I ran my fingers along one of the bases because I needed to confirm that I was still touching something real. The stone was cool and slightly damp, and the pressure of my palm left a faint, temporary warmth that the cistern erased as if embarrassed. People had written about the Medusa heads that serve as column bases in one corner of the cistern. I had seen photographs, two stone faces turned on their sides, their features weathered into a kind of private expression. I had expected them to be curiosities, artifacts that belonged to a museum. Instead, they were anchors in the dark, faces that the water seemed to recognize. When I reached them, the lantern light pooled over the carved eyes and the mouths that had been frozen in a moment before language. The faces looked like things that had been waiting. I stood there for a long time, watching my reflection in the water. The reflection was not a simple mirror. It was a layered thing, a photograph taken through glass. My face in the water was slightly delayed, as if the surface were a film that remembered movement a fraction of a breath later. When I moved my hand, the reflection followed with a small, patient lag. I told myself it was a trick of light and water. I told myself that the cistern was a place where perception thinned, and that I should not trust the senses that had served me above ground. I walked deeper into the chamber, following the walkway as it curved between columns. The lanterns made islands of light, and the dark between them felt like a held breath. The columns cast long, patient shadows that pooled in the water. At times the walkway seemed to narrow, and I had the sense that the cistern was rearranging itself around me, making the path more intimate. My phone screen was a pale, useless rectangle when I checked it. The battery icon was a thin line. The GPS spun and hesitated, the map on the screen a smear of gray. I told myself that I had come to a place that did not belong to the conveniences of the modern world. There were other things in the water. Small objects floated near the edges of the walkway. Coins, a scrap of cloth, a child's plastic toy that had been smoothed by time. Each object had the look of something that had been offered and then accepted. I bent to pick up a coin and found that my fingers came away wet and cold. The coin was older than I expected, its face worn, the date indistinct. I slipped it into my pocket because I wanted to carry a piece of the place with me, because travelers collect proof. As I moved, I began to notice faces in the reflections that were not mine. At first they were peripheral, a suggestion at the edge of the lantern light, a profile that did not match the angle of any column, a pair of eyes that seemed to look up from the water and then vanish when I turned my head. I told myself that the cistern was playing with me, that the mind fills empty spaces with familiar shapes. I told myself that I had been traveling too long and that fatigue makes the world generous with illusions. Then I saw a face that matched my own. It was not a perfect mirror. The face in the water had a small scar along the cheek that I did not have. Its hair was slightly longer. When I blinked, the reflection blinked a fraction later. The delay was small, but it made the face feel like a thing that had been given time to think. I reached out and touched the water with the tip of my finger. The surface accepted the contact and then smoothed itself, as if nothing had happened. The reflection rippled and reformed, and the face in the water looked at me with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite invitation. I stepped closer to the edge of the walkway. The lantern light pooled over the water, and the reflection's eyes seemed to hold a depth that made my chest tighten. I told myself to breathe slowly, to let the rhythm settle. I told myself that I was a man who had traveled enough to know the difference between myth and reality. The face in the water smiled, and the motion was a small private thing that made the hair on my arms lift. I do not know why I did it. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps a hunger that had been growing in me for months of solitary travel. I reached into my pocket and took out the coin I had found. I held it over the water and watched the reflection. The face in the water watched my hand with an attention that felt like a presence. I let the coin fall. The coin did not make a sound that could be named. Instead, the water accepted it, and then the surface closed over the small disturbance, as if the cistern were a patient mouth. The reflection's smile widened in a way that made my stomach drop. The face in the water leaned forward, and for a moment, I felt certain that it would step out of the reflection and into the walkway. I stepped back because stepping forward felt like a decision that could not be undone. The walkway under my feet felt narrower. The lantern light seemed to dim, not because the bulbs had failed, but because the air itself had thickened. I told myself to leave, to climb the stairwell and return to the city that smelled of frying spices and exhaust. I told myself that the cistern had been generous and that I had taken enough. As I turned, I saw movement at the far end of the chamber. A figure stood between two columns, half in shadow, half in the lantern light. It was a woman, her hair dark and long, her clothing the kind of simple dress that suggested a life lived close to the water. She did not walk toward me. She did not need to. Her presence rearranged the space between us. When she lifted her hand, the lantern light pooled over her palm and revealed a small object. A photograph, its edges softened by water. She spoke without moving her lips in a way that made the words feel like a thought placed in the air. "You should not take what the water keeps," she said in English that had a cadence I could not place. Her voice was not loud. It was a presence that filled the space like a scent. I told her I had not meant harm. I told her I had been curious. She looked at me with an expression that was not unkind. "Curiosity is a kind of hunger," she said. "The cistern feeds on what people leave behind." I asked her who she was. She smiled in a way that made the lines at the corners of her eyes deepen. "I am a keeper," she said, "not by title but by habit. Someone must watch what the water remembers." I asked her how long she had been there. She did not answer directly. Instead, she walked along the walkway with a motion that made the columns seem to lean in. The photograph in her hand was of a man standing at the edge of a river, his face turned toward the camera. When she held it up, the lantern light made the image look like a small private window. "People come and leave pieces," she said. "Some pieces the water keeps, some pieces it returns." I told her I had dropped a coin. She nodded as if she had expected that. "Coins are small promises," she said. "They buy a moment of forgetting." I asked her if I could retrieve it. She looked at me with an expression that made my chest tighten. "You can try," she said, "but the water does not give back what it has decided to keep." I moved to the edge and peered into the black. The coin was not visible. The surface was a sheet of glass that held the lantern light like a memory. I felt, with a clarity that made my hands cold, that the cistern had accepted the coin and had also accepted something else. A small, private piece of attention. The reflection of my face in the water looked at me with an expression that had my features, but not my history. The keeper watched me for a long moment. "People come to places like this to leave things," she said. "They leave grief, they leave names, they leave photographs. The water keeps them, and sometimes it rearranges them. It is not malicious. It is not kind. It simply remembers." I asked her what she meant by rearrange. She pointed to the Medusa heads at the corner of the chamber. "Look at them," she said. "They were moved once. They were placed where they are now because someone decided they should be hidden. The water remembers the hands that moved them." I thought of the photograph in her hand, and the way the faces in the water had not matched the people who stood above. I thought of the coin in my pocket and the small scar on the reflection's cheek. I felt with a slow, sinking certainty that the cistern had taken more than metal. "How do I leave?" I asked. She smiled in a way that made the lantern light pool. "You leave the way you came," she said, "but you do not leave empty. The cistern keeps a piece of the night for itself." I climbed the stairwell with the motion of someone who has been given a map that is missing a few lines. The air above felt thin and bright. The plaza smelled of frying spices and the distant exhaust of traffic. The city had resumed its ordinary rhythm. I walked back to my hotel with the coin in my pocket and the memory of the reflection's delayed smile in my chest. That night, in a room that smelled of detergent and the faint tang of the city, I took the coin out and held it to the light. The metal was cool and worn. On the edge, where the date should have been, there was a faint impression that looked like a small, shallow scar. I turned the coin over and found, tucked into the rim, a tiny fragment of something that was not metal, a sliver of paper with a single word written in a hand that trembled slightly. The word was in Turkish and English. "Remember." I do not know whether the cistern returned the coin or whether the keeper placed the fragment there. I do not know whether the reflection in the water was a promise or a warning. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the cool of the stone under my palm, the lantern light pooling over the Medusa heads, and the way the water kept a face that was almost mine. I should never have descended into the cistern after midnight. I did, and the water kept a piece of my attention. It returned something else in its place, and sometimes, when I stand in a crowd, I catch my reflection in a shop window and see, for a fraction of a breath, the scar that belongs to the face under the columns. I should never have climbed the hill after the gates closed. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the memory wants to blur. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own time, and Oaxaca had been a place I kept postponing until the postponement itself felt like a kind of cowardice. I wanted to stand where people had lived and died and arranged their lives into terraces and plazas, to feel how a city of stone remembers the hands that shaped it. I told myself I wanted to see Monte Alban at dusk, to watch the valley change color, and to listen to the way the wind moves through ruins. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would leave before the night closed. The archaeological site closes at sunset, and the guards are thorough in a way that makes the rules feel like a ritual. I had been on the last shuttle down, but I missed it because I had been taking photographs of a particular alignment of light on a low platform. By the time I reached the gate, the guard had already latched the iron chain and was walking away with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who has finished a day's work. He glanced back when he saw me, and, after a moment, lifted a hand in a gesture that was not quite invitation and not quite dismissal. "You can stay," he said in Spanish that I understood well enough. "But there is no one here at night." I told myself I would be alone and safe. I told myself that the ruins had been empty for centuries, and that the stones had nothing left to hide. The path up from the town is a narrow ribbon of packed earth and loose gravel. The air at that hour smelled of dust and the faint sweetness of drying herbs. The valley below was a scatter of lights, and the mountains beyond it were a patient, indifferent presence. The gate closed behind me with a motion that resisted and then yielded, and the sight accepted me as if it had been expecting a visitor. The plaza at the center of Monte Alban is a wide, deliberate space. The platforms and mounds rise like the ribs of something that once breathed. The stones are warm from the day's sun, and when I ran my hand along a carved edge, I felt the grooves that centuries of weather had softened, but not erased. I walked slowly because the place asked for slow movement, the kind of attention that makes the world feel like a conversation. The light thinned as the sun sank, and the shadows lengthened into shapes that made the terraces look like a city of sleeping giants. I found a small caretaker's hut near the edge of the site. It was a simple structure of adobe and wood, with a low roof and a single window that looked out over the valley. A cot leaned against one wall, and a small stove sat in the corner. Someone had left a lantern on the table, its glass clouded with age. I sat on the cot and watched the sky change color. The first stars appeared like small, precise points. The air cooled and the smell of the earth deepened into something that felt like memory. I had expected to sleep. Instead, I found myself awake and alert, as if the stones had a way of keeping attention. I walked back into the plaza and sat on the edge of a platform, my feet dangling above the ground. The valley below was a scatter of lights, and the town's noise was a distant texture. Up here, the world felt like a thing that had been arranged and then left to settle. I told myself that I was alone, and that the ruins were only stones, and that I had come to listen. The night has a way of rearranging scale. Distances that seemed small in daylight become vast, and the terraces that had felt like steps became cliffs. The wind moved through the plazas with a patience that made the stones seem to breathe. I noticed small details: the way lichen had taken root in a carved groove, the faint smear of soot on a low wall where someone had once burned offerings, the way a particular alignment of stones caught the moonlight and made a pale line across the plaza. Each detail felt like a sentence in a language I had only just begun to learn. At some point, I saw a light on the far side of the plaza. It was not the lantern from the hut. It was a narrow, steady glow that moved between the platforms like a small, deliberate thing. I told myself it was a flashlight, that someone else had been allowed to stay, that a researcher or a guard had returned. The light moved with a purpose that suggested it belonged to someone who knew the site well. I stood and walked toward it because curiosity is a kind of hunger, and I had come to this place to feed it. The figure holding the light was a woman. She wore a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and a long skirt that brushed the stones. Her hair was braided and silvered at the temples. When she turned, the lantern's glow revealed a face that had the kind of lines that come from a life lived in the sun and wind. She did not startle when she saw me. Instead, she smiled in a way that made the motion feel like a small private offering. "You should not be here alone," she said in Spanish, and then, when she saw my hesitation, she switched to English with a careful accent. "The night keeps things." I told her I had missed the shuttle and that the guard had let me stay. She nodded as if she had expected that. "I come to the plaza," she said. "Sometimes I bring candles. Sometimes I bring bread. The stones remember the hands that touch them." Her words were simple and precise. She moved with a kind of economy that suggested she had been doing the same small tasks for a long time. She held the lantern close to her chest and walked to the edge of a platform. There, She set the light down and arranged a small pile of offerings: a folded cloth, a handful of seeds, a scrap of paper with a name written on it. The motion was careful and deliberate, as if she were placing a small, private thing into the world. I watched because watching felt like a way to learn. The woman lit a candle from the lantern's flame and placed it among the offerings. The candle's light made the stones around it look like a small, intimate room. She spoke the name on the paper aloud, and the syllables hung in the air like a small, precise bell. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "Do you have someone to remember?" I told her I did not in the way she meant. I told her I traveled and that travel has a way of making absence feel like a presence. She listened as if the words were a small confession. Then she reached into her shawl and took out a photograph. It was a small, worn print with the edges softened by handling. She held it up to the lantern light and the image looked like a small, private window. A man with a wide smile, his arm around a child. "He was my brother," she said. "He left the valley many years ago. Sometimes the stones bring him back." I asked her what she meant. She smiled in a way that was not unkind. "The stones remember," she said. "They remember the hands that built them and the names that were spoken. When we come and speak the names, the place listens." I told her that sounded like a superstition. She shrugged. "Call it what you like," she said. "But when the night is quiet, the plaza keeps a kind of attention. It holds the shape of what was." We sat together on the edge of the platform and watched the candles burn. The woman's presence made the ruins feel less like a museum and more like a room where people had once lived. She told me stories in fragments: a child who had been found asleep on a low terrace, a family who had left offerings and then returned to find them rearranged, a man who had come to the plaza every year and then stopped coming. Each story had the texture of a thing that had been lived and then set down like a stone. When she spoke of the man who had stopped coming, her voice changed. She reached into her shawl and took out another scrap of paper. She unfolded it with a care that made the motion feel like a ritual. The paper had a single line written in a hand that trembled slightly. "Remember me." She placed the scrap among the offerings and then looked at me with an expression that made my chest tighten. "Sometimes," she said, "the stones give back what we leave. Sometimes they keep it. It is not a choice we make." I asked her if she had ever seen the stones give something back. She nodded. "Once," she said. "A photograph came to the edge of the plaza, as if the wind had carried it. It was wet, and the image had changed. The face looked older, as if time had moved differently for the picture." I thought of the photograph she had shown me, and the way the man's smile had seemed both present and distant. I thought of the candlelight and the way the stones had taken on a softness that made them look like a place where people might rest. I felt, with a slow, sinking certainty, that the plaza was not merely a place of memory, but a place that rearranged the things people left. "How do I leave?" I asked, because the question felt like a small, practical thing to ask in the face of something that wanted to be larger. She smiled in a way that made the lantern light pool. "You leave the way you came," she said. "But you do not leave empty. The plaza keeps a piece of the night for itself." I climbed down the path with the motion of someone who has been given a map that is missing a few lines. The air above the town felt thin and bright. The plaza behind me was a small, patient shape. I walked back to my hotel with the photograph the woman had given me folded in my pocket, a small, private thing that smelled faintly of smoke. That night, in a room that smelled of detergent and the faint tang of the city, I unfolded the photograph. The image had a faint film over it, like a veil. The man's face was the same, but there was a small change. A line at the corner of his mouth that had not been there before, a mark that suggested time had moved differently for the picture. Tucked into the back of the photograph was a scrap of paper with a single line written in Spanish and English: "Keep a light." I do not know whether the woman meant that the plaza would keep the memory, or whether she meant that tending a memory keeps it alive. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the warmth of the candle on my palm, the cool of the carved stone under my hand. and the way the terraces leaned in as if listening for the next name. I should never have climbed the hill after the gates closed. I did, and the ruins kept a piece of my night. I should never have taken the snowmobile into Pyramiden. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the memory wants to blur. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own weather, and the Arctic had been a destination I kept postponing until the postponement itself felt like a kind of cowardice. I wanted to stand where the world feels pared down to essentials, where wind and ice and the long light of summer, or the long dark of winter, make everything feel like a decision. Pyramiden was a ghost town on Svalbard, a Russian settlement frozen in time, and I told myself I would go, because I collect places that remember badly. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would leave before the weather turned. The boat that took me north left Longyearbyen at dawn, the harbor a scatter of small, patient shapes. The sea was a sheet of pewter, and the sky was a pale, indifferent dome. The captain spoke in a language I did not know, and his gestures were precise. He pointed toward the island and said a name that sounded like a promise. The boat moved through water that smelled faintly of metal and cold, and the land rose out of the horizon like a memory. Pyramiden sits in a bowl of mountains, its buildings arranged like a small, deliberate village that had been placed and then abandoned. The snow had been pushed into neat banks, and the roofs were capped with a thin, patient crust. The main hotel, a squat building with a facade that had once been painted a bright color, now held the pale, weathered look of things left to the elements. I walked through the town with a guide for a while, listening to the history that people tell about places like this. The mines, the families, the sudden departures. The guide pointed out a kindergarten with small frozen handprints on the window, a school with desks still in place, a theater with a stage that had not been cleared. The town felt like a room where someone had left the lights on and then stepped out. I had booked a night in the old hotel because the listing promised solitude and a view of the mountains. The receptionist was a woman who had the economy of someone who works in a place where weather is a constant. She handed me a key on a ring that had been polished by use. The corridor to my room smelled of old wood and the faint tang of coal. The radiator in the corner hissed in a way that made the room feel like a living thing. I set my bag down and opened the window to the view. The valley below was a bowl of white, and the sky above was a thin, patient sheet. I had expected to sleep. Instead, I found myself awake and alert, as if the town had a way of keeping attention. I walked the empty streets with a flashlight in my hand, though the light was more a courtesy than a necessity. The buildings leaned in toward one another as if to share warmth. The kindergarten's door was unlocked. I stepped inside because curiosity is a kind of hunger, and I had come to this place to feed it. The room smelled of old paint and the faint sweetness of crayons. Small chairs were arranged around low tables. On one table, a row of wooden blocks had been left in a careful stack. A small stuffed animal lay on the floor, its fur matted and its button eye loose. I picked it up because I wanted to confirm that the object was real. The fabric was cold, and the stuffing had settled in a way that suggested long disuse. When I held the toy, I felt the weight of a child's hand in my memory, a pressure that was not mine. There were drawings taped to the wall, their colors faded but their lines still bright with intention. One drawing showed a house with a tall chimney and a sun that had been drawn with a circle and rays. Another showed a figure with a wide smile and arms outstretched. The handwriting on a small note pinned to the corkboard was careful and precise. It read, in Russian and in a translation the guide had given me earlier, "We will come back." The note had been folded and refolded until the paper was soft. I left the kindergarten with the stuffed animal tucked under my arm because I wanted to carry a piece of the place with me, because travelers collect proof. The town accepted the theft as if it were a small private transaction. The snow under my boots made a soft, yielding sound that the night registered as emotion. I walked toward the school because the building had become a question I could not ignore. The school was a long, low structure with windows that looked like eyes. Inside, the desks were arranged in rows, and the blackboard still held chalk marks that had been left in a hurry. A child's sweater hung on a peg by the door, its sleeve frayed. On a shelf near the window, there was a box of photographs, their edges softened by time. I opened the box and found images of children playing in the snow, of families gathered around a table, of a man in a uniform standing with a small boy on his shoulders. The photographs had been taken with a care that made them feel like offerings. One photograph caught my eye. It showed a group of children standing in front of the kindergarten, their faces bright and unguarded. In the back row, a small boy looked directly at the camera with an expression that made my chest tighten. He wore a hat with ear flaps and a scarf that had been knitted with a pattern of small diamonds. I held the photograph to the light and saw on the back a name and a date. The date was the year the town had been abandoned. I put the photograph in my pocket because I wanted to carry the image with me. The town felt like a place that kept its own ledger, and I wanted to be a witness. I walked back to the hotel with the stuffed animal and the photograph in my pockets, the weight of both like small stones. That night, the wind rose and the radiator in my room made a slow, patient noise as it adjusted to the cold. I lay awake and thought of the children in the photographs, of the way the town had been emptied and then left to the weather. I told myself that the people had left for practical reasons, that the mines had closed and the families had moved on. I told myself that the objects I had taken were relics, and that relics do not have agency. At some point in the small hours, there was a motion outside my door. It was not a sound that could be named. Instead, the corridor registered a presence that had chosen to make itself known. I opened the door and found the hallway empty. The light from the window at the end of the hall made a pale rectangle on the floor. I stepped into the corridor and felt the air change. The hotel had a way of rearranging attention, and the motion I had felt was like a hand turning a page. I walked down to the lobby because the building had become a question I could not ignore. The receptionist's desk was empty, and the kettle on the stove had cooled. The stuffed animal in my bag felt heavier than it had earlier. I set it on the desk and watched the way the lamplight pooled over its fur. The photograph in my pocket seemed to press against my thigh like a small, insistent thing. When I turned, I saw movement in the doorway to the dining room. A small figure stood there, half in shadow, half in the lamplight. It was a child, no more than 7 or 8, wearing a hat with ear flaps and a scarf with a diamond pattern. The child's face was pale in the lamplight, and when he looked at me, his eyes were the kind of eyes that have seen a long winter. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence rearranged the space between us. I told myself I was tired, that the mind makes images when it is alone. The child stepped forward and placed a small hand on the stuffed animal. The motion was careful and precise, as if the child were confirming that the object was real. When the child's fingers touched the toy, the fabric warmed under his palm in a way that made my chest tighten. He pointed to the photograph in my pocket with a small, deliberate motion. I took it out and handed it to him. He held the image with a care that made the paper look like a fragile thing. He looked at the faces and then at me. His expression did not change, but his eyes seemed to hold a question that was older than the town. He reached into his coat and took out a small scrap of paper. He unfolded it with a care that made the motion feel like a ritual. On the paper was a single line written in a hand that trembled slightly. "Stay where you are." The child placed the scrap on the desk, and then, with a motion that was both gentle and final, he turned and walked toward the door. I followed, because leaving felt like a decision that could not be undone. The child walked out into the night, and the snow closed over his footprints, as if the town were erasing the motion. I stood in the doorway and watched until the figure was a small, patient shape against the white. When I returned to my room, the photograph in my pocket had changed. The boy in the image looked older by a small, precise margin. The scarf's pattern had a new thread, a line that had not been there before. Tucked into the back of the photograph was a scrap of paper with a single line written in Russian and English. "Remember us." I do not know whether the child was a memory or a person. I do not know whether the town rearranges the things people leave, or whether it simply keeps them in a way that makes the living feel like intruders. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the weight of the stuffed animal in my hand, the cold of the photograph against my palm, and the way the town seemed to hold its breath until someone spoke a name. I should never have taken the snowmobile into Pyramiden. I did, and the town kept a piece of my night. It returned something else in its place, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I take the photograph out and try to remember which face belonged to the living and which to the place that keeps them. I should never have climbed into the rusted gondola at dusk. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the memory wants to blur. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own silence, and Pripyat had been on my list for years, an empty city folded into the aftermath of a decision that changed the world. I wanted to stand where time had been stopped and see how a place remembers the moment it was abandoned. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would leave before the light failed. I told myself these things as the bus that carried us through the exclusion zone slowed, and the landscape opened into a town that had been left like a photograph. The amusement park sits at the edge of the city, a small cluster of attractions that were never used for the season they were built to serve. The Ferris wheel is the landmark everyone photographs, a skeletal circle against the sky, its gondolas hanging like empty teeth. When I first saw it from the road, the wheel looked smaller than I had imagined and larger than memory. The metal was pitted and the paint had long since surrendered to the weather. Trees had grown up around the base, their trunks pushing through the concrete as if the earth itself were reclaiming the place. We were part of a small group led by a guide who moved with the economy of someone who has learned to keep distance from the past. He spoke in a language I did not know, and then translated in clipped English, offering facts that felt like measured offerings. The date the park was scheduled to open, the names of the rides, the way the city emptied in a single, hurried night. He told us to stay on the paths and not to touch anything that looked fragile. He said these things with a tone that made them feel like rules and like prayers. I walked toward the Ferris wheel because the structure had become a question I could not ignore. The ground underfoot was a mix of cracked asphalt and grass that had pushed through in stubborn green lines. The gondolas hung at odd angles, some tilted as if frozen mid-rotation. I ran my hand along the wheel's support and felt the texture of rust and old paint. The metal was cool and slightly rough, and the pressure of my palm left a faint warmth that the air quickly erased. The light that evening was a thin, patient gold. The sky had the color of a photograph that has been left in the sun too long. Shadows lengthened, and the town took on the look of a place that had been arranged and then left to settle. The Ferris wheel cast a long, skeletal shadow across the plaza, and the gondolas looked like small, patient rooms suspended in the air. I told myself I would not climb. I told myself that the wheel was a relic and that relics are best observed from a respectful distance. Then a child in our group pointed at a gondola that hung lower than the others, its door slightly ajar. The guide moved toward it with a caution that made the motion feel like a ritual. He peered inside and then looked back at us. "Sometimes the wind moves them," he said. "Sometimes animals climb. Sometimes the mechanism shifts. It is not safe to climb." The words were a kind of instruction and a kind of warning. I nodded because nodding is a small, civilized thing to do when someone else offers a map for a place you have not yet learned to read. The guide closed the gondola door and moved on. The group followed, their footsteps a small, deliberate sound that the plaza registered as motion. I stayed behind. There are moments when curiosity feels like a hunger, and I have learned to recognize the sensation. It is not always noble. It is not always brave. It is a small, insistent thing that pushes at the edges of caution. I walked to the gondola and put my hand on the metal. The door's latch resisted and then yielded with a motion that was slow and deliberate. The interior smelled of old fabric and a faint sweetness that I could not name. The seat was cracked and the padding had settled into a hollow that suggested a body had rested there long ago. I climbed in because the motion felt inevitable. The gondola rocked slightly under my weight, and the wheel's structure accepted the motion as if it had been waiting. I sat and looked out through the grime-streaked window. The town spread below like a map of small, patient shapes. Apartment blocks with broken windows, a school with a playground frozen in mid-use, a hospital whose facade had the tired look of a place that had been emptied in a hurry. The horizon was a thin line where the sky met the distant trees. I expected the wheel to be still. I had imagined a frozen circle, a monument to a single night. Instead, the gondola moved. It was not a dramatic motion. The wheel did not lurch or groan. It turned with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the mechanism had decided to remember how to move. The motion made the town below shift in a way that rearranged scale. Buildings that had seemed distant became intimate. The air in the gondola felt cooler as we rose, and the light pooled in the corners like a patient thing. I told myself to be rational. I told myself that the wind or a settling of the structure had set the wheel in motion. I told myself that I was a traveler who had seen many odd things, and that this was one more. The gondola rose and the town unfolded beneath me. The wheel's arc made a slow, patient circle, and the motion felt like a sentence being finished. When we reached the top, the view opened in a way that made my chest tighten. The city lay like a small, patient map, and beyond it the power plant's silhouette rose against the sky. The cooling towers were a distant, indifferent presence. I felt, with a clarity that made my hands cold, that the wheel had been built to give people a perspective, and that perspective had been given to me in a way that felt like a gift and like a theft. At the apex, the gondola paused. The motion was not mechanical so much as deliberate, as if the wheel had decided to hold the view for a moment. I looked down and saw, in the plaza below, a figure standing where there had been no one moments before. The figure was small and wrapped in a coat that had the look of something worn for many winters. When the figure lifted a hand, the motion was careful and precise. The hand held a small object that glinted in the light. I felt the gondola tilt, a subtle shift that made my stomach drop. The figure below raised the object and then lowered it, and the motion made the plaza look like a stage. I could not hear a sound that could be named. Instead, the motion registered as a presence that had chosen to make itself known. The figure's face was turned away, and yet I felt, with a slow, sinking certainty, that the person had seen me. The gondola began to descend. The wheel's rhythm resumed, and the town moved beneath us like a slow, patient film. When we reached the ground, the guide and the group were waiting with expressions that had the economy of people who have learned to keep distance from the past. The guide looked at me, and then at the gondola. His eyes narrowed in a way that made the motion feel like a small, private calculation. "Did you see anything?" he asked in English that had the clipped cadence of someone who has learned to ask questions carefully. I told him I had seen a figure. He nodded as if he had expected that. "Sometimes people come back," he said. "Sometimes they wait." I did not ask what he meant. The words were a kind of map I did not yet know how to read. I walked away from the wheel with the motion of someone who has been given a small, private thing to carry. The town accepted my movement as if it were a small, deliberate offering. That night, in a guest house on the edge of the exclusion zone, I took the photograph I had carried with me out of my bag. It was a small print of my father, folded until the creases were soft. I had brought it because travel has a way of making absence feel like a presence. I held the image to the light and saw, beneath the surface, a faint alteration, a line at the corner of his mouth that had not been there before, a small mark that suggested time had moved differently for the picture. Tucked into the back of the photograph was a scrap of paper with a single line written in Ukrainian and English. "Keep the view." I do not know whether the Ferris wheel turned because the wind moved it, or because the town decided to give me a perspective. I do not know whether the figure in the plaza was a person or a memory. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the gondola's seat under my weight, the cool of the metal against my palm, and the way the town looked from above as if it were a map someone had folded and then left on a table. I should never have climbed into the rusted gondola at dusk. I did, and the wheel kept a piece of my attention. It returned something else in its place, and sometimes, when I stand in a crowd and look up at the sky, I catch a glimpse of a small patient circle and feel the tilt of a gondola that remembers how to rise. I should never have bought the mirror from the stall that smelled of orange peel and old wood. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the memory wants to blur. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own rhythms, and Marrakesh had been a city I had promised myself for years. I wanted the heat and the color, the way a place can arrange its life into markets and courtyards and the slow choreography of bargaining. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would not let the city rearrange the pieces of me that I had been carrying. I told myself I would leave before the night closed. The Medina is a maze that makes a map of itself only after you have walked it for a long time. The alleys are narrow and shaded, the walls stained with the memory of hands and rain. The air is layered, spices and frying oil, the faint metallic tang of iron, the sweetness of oranges stacked in pyramids. Lanterns hang from low beams and throw patterned light across the cobbles, making the ground look like a page of script. I move through the souk with the slow attention of someone who has learned to let a place reveal itself in fragments. I wanted to be present in the way a person listens to a story, not in the way a tourist checks boxes. The stall where I found the mirror was tucked into a corner that smelled of citrus and dust. It was a narrow space, shelves crowded with brass trays, carved boxes, and textiles folded with the care of people who know how to preserve color. The mirror leaned against the back wall, its frame carved with a pattern of interlaced vines. The glass was not perfectly flat. It had a slight waviness that made reflections look like memories seen through a thin veil. When I lifted it, the frame was warm from the sun that had found it earlier in the day. The vendor, an older man with a face like weathered leather, watched me with an expression that was not quite curiosity and not quite calculation. "You like it?" he asked in French that had the soft cadence of the place. When he saw my hesitation, he switched to English with a careful accent. "It is old. It has seen many houses." I told him I liked the way it made the light look softer. I told him I liked the way my face in the glass seemed to belong to a different time. He nodded as if I had given the correct answer and wrapped the mirror in a cloth with hands that moved with a practiced economy. He did not ask for much money. He did not need to. The exchange felt like a small, private ritual. I carried the mirror back to the riad where I was staying. The riad was a house folded inward, a courtyard at its center with a fountain and a fig tree. The rooms opened onto the courtyard like pages in a book. My room had a low ceiling and a window that looked onto the inner garden. The mirror fit against the wall opposite the window, and when I stood in front of it, the courtyard's light pooled across the glass and made my reflection look like a photograph taken from a distance. I had expected the mirror to be a decorative thing, a souvenir that would remind me of the city's color. Instead, the first thing that struck me was how the mirror rearranged attention. When I looked into it, I did not simply see my face. I saw a version of myself that had been altered by the glass's slight waviness, a line at the corner of my mouth that I did not have, a small scar along the jaw that belonged to someone else. The effect was subtle, like a memory that has been retold and softened. I told myself it was a trick of light and that I had been traveling too long. I told myself that mirrors are instruments of vanity and that I should not trust them to tell me anything true. That night, the riad settled into the kind of quiet that makes the world feel like a held breath. The fountain's water moved with a patient rhythm. The lanterns in the courtyard threw patterned shadows that made the walls look like pages of a book. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the house breathe. The mirror across from the bed caught the courtyard light and made a pale rectangle on the ceiling. I told myself I would not look into it again. I told myself that the city had given me enough. At some point I rose and walked to the mirror because the motion felt inevitable. The room smelled of jasmine and the faint tang of cooking oil from a kitchen below. I stood close enough that my face filled the glass. The reflection looked back with a small delay. as if the surface were a film that remembered movement a fraction of a breath later. When I moved my hand, the reflection followed with a patient lag. The line at the corner of the mouth that I had noticed earlier seemed more pronounced. I reached out and touched the glass with the pad of my finger. The surface was cool, and the pressure of my touch left a faint, temporary warmth that the mirror erased as if embarrassed. I had the sense then that the mirror was not merely reflecting light, but holding something like attention. It made me think of the way people leave things in places and expect them to remain unchanged. The vendor had said the mirror had seen many houses. I wondered what else it had seen. The next morning, I walked through the Medina with the mirror wrapped in cloth under my arm. The city had a clarity that made the colors feel like a promise. I visited a tannery where hides were arranged in shallow vats and the air smelled of dye and lime. I climbed a minaret and watched the city unfold in a scatter of roofs and satellite dishes. At each place, I felt the mirror's weight in my bag like a small, secret stone. I told myself I would not look into it until I returned to the Riad. When I came back that evening, the courtyard was quieter. The Riad's other guests had gone out to dinner or to the square. I unwrapped the mirror and set it against the wall. The glass caught the courtyard light and made my reflection look like a photograph taken from a distance. I noticed, with a small tightening in my chest, that the scar along the jaw in the reflection had deepened. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin feel thin. I told myself I was tired. I told myself that travel makes the world generous with illusions. I told myself that the mirror was an object, and objects do not have intentions. I told myself these things because they were the only things I could tell myself. That night, I dreamed of a corridor of mirrors. Each mirror held a face that was almost mine and almost not mine. I walked along the corridor and each reflection turned its head a fraction later than I did, as if the glass were a film that remembered movement a breath after the world. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sense that the house had shifted while I slept. When I rose, the mirror was not where I had left it. The frame leaned at a slight angle, and the glass faced the courtyard in a way that made the fountain's light pool across it. I had not moved it. I had not left the room. The motion felt like a small, private rearrangement. I told myself that the house settles, that objects shift with the night. I told myself that I had been traveling too long. I left the Riad and walked into the Medina because the motion of the place had made me restless. The market was a choreography of hands and voices. A woman sold spices in small cones, their colors arranged like a painter's palette. A man carved wooden spoons with a patience that made the motion look like a prayer. I moved through the crowd with the mirror's weight in my bag like a small, secret stone. At a stall near the edge of the square, an old woman sat on a low stool and arranged small amulets on a cloth. Her hands were the color of dried dates, and when she looked up at me, her eyes had the clarity of someone who has learned to see what others miss. She pointed to the mirror in my bag with a motion that was both invitation and command. "You carry a thing that remembers," she said in French that had the soft cadence of the place. When I hesitated, she switched to English with a careful accent. "Some things keep what they see. Some things ask for a witness." I told her I had bought the mirror as a souvenir. She smiled in a way that made the lines at the corners of her eyes deepen. "Souvenirs are small promises," she said. "They ask to be remembered." She reached into a small pouch and took out a scrap of paper. She folded it with a care that made the motion feel like a ritual and handed it to me. On the paper was a single line written in a hand that trembled slightly. "Keep a light." I thanked her and walked away because the motion felt like the only honest thing to do. The market accepted my movement as if it were a small, deliberate offering. I returned to the Riad and set the scrap of paper on the bedside table. I lit a small lamp and placed it near the mirror. The lamp's light made the glass glow, and the courtyard shadows take on a softness that made the room feel like a small, private chapel. That night, I slept with the lamp on. The mirror's reflection held the light and made my face look like a photograph taken from a distance. I dreamed of faces that leaned in, of hands that reached through glass and left faint, temporary warmth. I woke with the sense that the house had rearranged itself while I slept. When I left Marrakesh days later, I wrapped the mirror in cloth and carried it to the airport. The vendor at the stall had been gone when I returned to thank him. The Medina had the same choreography of hands and voices, but something in the rhythm felt altered, as if a small, private change had been made. I placed the mirror in my bag and told myself I would not look into it again until I was home. Weeks later, in a city that smelled of exhaust and rain, I took the mirror out and set it on my dresser. The glass caught the apartment's light and made my reflection look like a photograph taken from a distance. I noticed, with a small tightening in my chest, that the scar along the jaw in the reflection had deepened again. It was a small change, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin feel thin. Tucked into the back of the mirror's frame, where the wood met the glass, I found a scrap of paper I had not seen before. The handwriting was small and precise. The line was in French and English. Keep a light. I do not know whether the mirror kept what it saw, or whether it simply rearranged the way I remember. I only know that when I stand in front of it now, I see a face that is mine, and not mine. A photograph taken from a distance, and I feel the weight of a city that asked me to witness something it would not say aloud. I should never have bought the mirror from the stall that smelled of orange peel and old wood. I did, and the mirror kept a piece of my attention. It returned something else in its place, and sometimes when the apartment is quiet and the lamp is low, I catch my reflection and see, for a fraction of a breath, a line at the corner of my mouth that belongs to a night in a courtyard where the light pooled like a promise. I should never have accepted the invitation to stay above the tango club. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the night wants to smear into a single, indistinct stain. I am an American who travels to cities that keep their own music, and Buenos Aires had been on my list for years. An old city that arranges its life around rhythms and then hides the reasons for those rhythms in narrow alleys. I told myself I wanted to learn the city's pulse, to feel how a place could hold longing and make it into a dance. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would leave before the night finished its work. I met Martine in a cafe near San Telmo, a place where the tables are small and the coffee is thick enough to be a decision. He had the easy manner of someone who has lived in a city that expects you to be curious. He spoke English with a soft cadence and an occasional Spanish word that made his sentences feel like a stitched garment. "You should stay above the club," he said when I mentioned I wanted to hear tango without the tourist crowd. "It is quieter. You will hear the music as if it were a neighbor." The apartment was on the third floor of a narrow building whose facade had the kind of flaking paint that reads as history. The stairwell smelled of lemon oil and old wood. The door to the flat opened into a small vestibule with a coat rack and a mirror whose glass had a faint waviness. The living room was modest. A couch with a throw, a bookshelf with paperbacks in Spanish and English, and a window that looked down onto the street where the club's awning made a dark stripe. A narrow balcony faced the alley between buildings, and from it I could see the club's entrance and the people who lingered there like a current. Martine showed me the room I would sleep in. It was small and had a single bed with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. He left a lamp on the bedside table and told me he would be at the club until late. "If you wake and the music is loud, do not be afraid," he said. "The music is a thing that remembers. It will not harm you." His words were a kind of instruction and a kind of warning. I nodded because nodding is a small, civilized thing to do when someone else offers you a map for a place you have not yet learned to read. He closed the door behind him with a motion that suggested he had left a part of himself in the room and was taking the rest with him. The club below had the kind of reputation that makes people tell stories in low voices. It was not one of the tourist milongas with staged dancers and polite applause. It was a place where locals went to move in ways that had been taught by hands and bodies, and the slow accumulation of nights. The sign above the door was a simple painted rectangle. The doorway opened into a narrow foyer, and then the room widened into a floor of polished wood and low tables. The air inside the club was a layered thing. Cigarette smoke that had been filtered by decades of breath, the faint metallic tang of spilled wine, and the warm, intimate scent of bodies moving close. I had expected the music to be a performance. Instead, it was a presence. The band played with a patience that made the notes feel like small, deliberate offerings. The violin's line curved and folded. The bandoneon breathed in and out like a living thing, and the piano laid down a foundation that made the floor feel like a heart. The dancers moved with a kind of economy that suggested they had been practicing the same conversation for years. When I watched, I felt like an intruder in a private ritual. I returned to the apartment with the music in my chest. The lamp on the bedside table made a small pool of light. I lay on the bed and listened to the way the building carried the sound. The music did not simply travel through the floor, it settled into the walls and the wood and the plaster. It made the apartment feel like a room that had been arranged to receive it. I told myself I would sleep. Instead, I found myself awake and alert, as if the music had a way of keeping attention. At some point in the night, the music changed. It did not become louder in a conventional way. Instead, the band's phrasing grew more intimate, the violin's line bending into a melody that felt like a name being spoken. The dancers moved closer together, and the floor seemed to take on a different geometry, as if the room had been reshaped by the motion. I sat up and walked to the window, because the motion felt inevitable. The balcony door was unlocked, and when I stepped out, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of rain that had not yet fallen. From the balcony, the club's interior looked like a stage set seen from above. The dancers were small, precise figures. The band's light made the polished floor gleam. A man at a table near the band had his head bowed, and when he lifted it, his face was the kind of face that has been shaped by long nights. He looked up toward the building, and, for a moment, his eyes met mine. The motion was small and deliberate, and I felt with a clarity that made my chest tighten that he had seen me. I told myself to go back to bed. I told myself that the music was a thing that belonged to the night and that I was a guest. I told myself these things because they were the only things I could tell myself. Instead, I leaned on the balcony railing and watched the way the light pooled on the street. The club's door opened and closed as people came and went, and the air carried fragments of conversation in Spanish and English. A woman in a red dress stepped out and paused on the sidewalk, her hand pressed to her chest as if she were holding a small private thing. She looked up at the building and then at the balcony where I stood. Her eyes were dark and precise. She smiled in a way that made the motion feel like an invitation. She did not come up. She did not need to. Her presence on the street rearranged the night. I felt the apartment lean in, as if the building itself were listening. The music below shifted again, and the violin's line threaded through the bandoneon like a needle through cloth. The woman on the sidewalk lifted her hand, and then lowered it, and the motion made the street look like a stage. I went back inside because the motion of the place had made me restless. The lamp's light made the room feel like a small, private chapel. I lay down and tried to sleep, but the music had a way of making attention into a physical thing. I found myself thinking of the people in the club as if they were characters in a story I had not yet learned to read. I thought of the man who had looked up, of the woman in the red dress, of Martine who had left me with a lamp and a sentence. In the small hours, I woke to a different quality of light. The lamp on the bedside table had been moved to the floor and was casting a low, oblique glow that made the ceiling look like a map. The quilt on the bed had been folded back, and the pillow bore an indentation that suggested someone had been there. I told myself I had been dreaming. I told myself that the building settles and that objects shift with the night. I told myself these things because they were the only things I could tell myself. I rose and walked to the door. The hallway outside my room was empty, but the apartment felt occupied in a way that made the air thicker. I moved toward the living room and found, on the couch, a small scrap of paper. It had not been there when I went to bed. The handwriting on it was neat and precise. In Spanish and in English, the line read, "Stay where you are." The sentence made my chest tighten. I told myself it was a note left by Martine or a neighbor, a small private instruction about noise or safety. I told myself that the city is full of people who leave messages for one another. I told myself these things because they were the only things I could tell myself. I folded the scrap and put it in my pocket because I wanted to carry a piece of the place with me. I walked to the balcony and looked down. The club's door was closed and the street was empty. The woman in the red dress was gone. The light in the club's windows was a soft, patient glow. I felt, with a slow, sinking certainty, that the night had rearranged itself while I slept. When I returned to the bed, the photograph I always carry with me was not where I had left it. I keep a small picture of my father folded until the creases are soft. It is a private thing I take on long trips. The photograph had been on the bedside table. Now it was gone. In its place, tucked under the lamp's base, was a small, damp smear that looked like a fingerprint and a single line written in a hand that trembled slightly. Remember. I do not know who left the scrap on the couch or the line under the lamp. I do not know whether the woman on the street had been a person or a motion the city made to test me. I only know that when I left Buenos Aires the next morning, the photograph was back on the bedside table, its edges softened and a faint film over the surface as if it had been touched by water. Tucked into the back of the frame was a scrap of paper with a single line written in Spanish and English. Keep the music. I do not know whether the club keeps what it hears or whether it simply rearranges the way people remember. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the violin's line like a thread along my ribs, the bandoneon's breath under my skin, and the way the apartment leaned in as if listening for the next name. I should never have accepted the invitation to stay above the tango club. I did, and the city kept a piece of my night. I should never have agreed to sleep among the tombs. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the night wants to smear into a single, indistinct stain. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own histories like living things, and Cairo had been on my list for years, an old city folded into itself, where streets become stories, and stories become the architecture of a life. I told myself I wanted to see the city of the dead because I collect places that remember badly. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would leave before the sun finished its work. I told myself these things as the taxi threaded between buildings and the city opened into a long, patient sprawl of mausoleums and narrow lanes. The necropolis is not a single place but a city of its own, a layered settlement where the living and the dead share thresholds. Houses press against tombs, and families have lived for generations in rooms that open onto courtyards of stone. I had arranged to stay with a man named Karim, who kept a small guest room above a family crypt. He met me at the edge of the district with a lantern and a map that had been folded until its creases were soft. His English was careful and precise. "You will see how the city breathes at night," he said. "It is different from the day." We walked through lanes that smelled of dust and cardamom and the faint metallic tang of old stone. The air cooled as we moved deeper into the necropolis. The light from the lantern made the carved names on the mausoleum facades look like lines of script that had been set in relief. Children slept on low mats in doorways. A woman swept a narrow step with a broom made of palm fronds. The living moved with a quiet economy, as if they had learned to share space with memory. Karim's room was small and simple. A narrow bed, a low table, a shelf with a few books, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where a single fig tree grew between two tombs. The walls were stone and cool to the touch. He left a small lamp on the table and told me he would be downstairs if I needed anything. "We keep the names," he said as he closed the door. "We say them at night." The phrase lodged in my chest like a pebble. I had expected the necropolis to be a museum of grief, a place where the dead were arranged and labeled. Instead, the first thing that struck me was how the place rearranged time. The day had a brightness that made everything seem like a photograph. The night made the same objects into living things. The lamp's light pooled on the table and made the stone look like a page. I lay on the bed and listened to the courtyard breathe. The fig tree's leaves moved with a patient rhythm. The city beyond the walls was a distant suggestion. I had brought a small photograph with me, a worn print of my sister taken years before she left. I carried it because travel has a way of making absence feel like a presence. I placed the photograph on the table beside the lamp and watched the way the light made the image look like a small, private window. The face in the photograph was familiar in a way that made my skin tighten. I told myself I would sleep. Instead, I found myself awake and alert, as if the necropolis had a way of keeping attention. At some point in the night, the courtyard door opened, and a woman came in carrying a tray with tea. She moved with a quiet, deliberate economy. Her hands were steady. She set the tray on the table and poured a cup without spilling. The tea smelled of mint and something darker I could not name. She did not speak at first. She looked at the photograph, and then at me, with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition. "You are not from here," she said in English that had the soft cadence of someone who had learned the language in fragments. I told her I was a traveler. I told her I had come to see the city at night. She nodded as if she had expected that. "We say the names," she said. "We say them so the walls remember." She moved to the window and looked out at the courtyard. The fig tree's silhouette was a dark shape against the sky. "Names are a kind of light," she said. "They keep a place from forgetting." I asked her what she meant. She smiled in a way that made the lines at the corners of her eyes deepen. "When we say a name, the stone listens," she said. "When the stone listens, it keeps a place for that person." Her words were simple and precise. She told me that families in the necropolis come at night to speak names aloud, to leave small offerings, to set a lamp by a niche in a wall. She said that the walls have memory, and that memory is not neutral. "Some names are heavy," she said. "Some names are light. The walls learn the difference." I listened because listening felt like a way to learn. The woman poured tea and handed me a cup. The liquid was warm, and the cup fit my hand in a way that made the motion feel like a small, private ritual. She told me stories in fragments. A child who had been found asleep on a tomb, and then adopted by a family that lived above it. A man who had left a photograph and returned years later to find it rearranged. A woman who had come every night for a year to speak a name until the stone seemed to answer. When she spoke of the photograph, her voice changed. She reached into her sleeve and took out a small scrap of paper. She unfolded it with a care that made the motion feel like a ritual. On the paper was a single line written in Arabic and in English. "Do not take the names." The line made my chest tighten. I told myself it was a warning about theft, a practical instruction in a place where objects are small and valuable. She shook her head. "Not that kind of taking," she said. "When people take names from the walls take something back." I had the sense then that the necropolis was not merely a place where the dead were stored, but a place that rearranged what people left. The walls did not simply hold names. They kept them in a way that made the living feel like guests. I thought of the photograph on the table, and the way the lamp's light made the image look like a small, private window. The woman watched me with an expression that was not unkind. "Do you have someone to remember?" she asked. I told her I did. I told her about my sister and the way absence had become a companion. She nodded and reached for the photograph. Her fingers were cool and precise as she took the image and held it to the lamp's light. She did not look at the face so much as at the edges, at the way the paper had been folded and handled. "We will say the name," she said. "We will leave a lamp." We walked through the lanes with the photograph wrapped in a cloth. The necropolis at night is a place of narrow passages and small courtyards. of niches carved into walls, and of doors that open onto rooms where families sleep. Lamps burned in many of the niches, their light making the stone look like a page. People moved with a quiet economy, and when they saw us, they nodded as if we were part of a long, patient choreography. We stopped at a wall where names had been carved in a dense, patient script. The woman set the photograph in a small niche and placed a lamp beside it. She spoke the name aloud in Arabic, and the syllables hung in the air like a small, precise bell. The stone seemed to accept the sound. I felt, with a clarity that made my chest tighten, that the wall had listened. When we returned to the room, the photograph felt lighter in my hands, as if the act of leaving it had removed a small weight. The woman sat and told me that sometimes the walls return things in ways that are not expected. They do not return objects, she said. They return changes. I slept in a bed that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old stone. I dreamed of corridors of names, of faces that leaned in from the margins. I woke in the small hours and found the lamp on the table moved to the floor and the photograph gone. My first thought was that someone had taken it. I dressed and walked into the courtyard because the motion of the place had made me restless. The courtyard was a small, patient room. The fig tree's leaves moved in the night air. Lamps burned in niches along the walls. I walked to the niche where we had left the photograph and found, instead of the image, a small scrap of paper tucked into the stone. The paper was damp at the edges. When I unfolded it, the handwriting was small and precise. The line was in Arabic and English. "Remember the living." The sentence made my chest tighten in a way that was not entirely fear. It felt like a benediction and a command. I thought of the woman and the way she had spoken the name. I thought of the walls and the way they had listened. I felt, with a slow, sinking certainty, that the necropolis had taken the photograph and had left something else in its place. When I returned to the room, the photograph was on the table, its edges softened, and a faint film over the surface as if it had been touched by water. The face in the image looked the same, but there was a small change. A line at the corner of the mouth that had not been there before. A mark that suggested time had moved differently for the picture. Tucked into the back of the photograph was a scrap of paper with the same line. "Remember the living." I do not know whether the walls keep names to protect them or to rearrange them. I do not know whether the photograph was taken into the stone or whether someone else moved it. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the cool of the stone under my palm, the lamp's light pooling on the table, and the way the necropolis listens when a name is spoken aloud. I should never have agreed to sleep among the tombs. I did, and the city kept a piece of my night. It returned something else in its place. And sometimes, when I stand in a crowd and hear a name spoken, I feel the walls lean in as if listening for the next one. I should never have taken the night bus across the Altiplano. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the memory wants to blur. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own light, and Bolivia had been on my list for a long time. I wanted the salt flats because people write about them as if they are a place where the world forgets its edges. I wanted to stand where the horizon is a single decision and the sky seems to press its face close to the earth. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would leave before the night finished rearranging the stars. The bus left La Paz after midnight, a long vehicle that moved through the dark with the patient determination of something that has been given a route and will follow it. The road climbed and then flattened, and the air changed from the city's metallic tang to a thin, dry clarity that made my lungs feel like new instruments. The driver kept the headlights low, and the landscape outside the window was a suggestion of shapes. Low hills, a scatter of distant lights, the occasional silhouette of a llama. I slept in fits and woke with the motion of the bus in my bones, the world outside a slow, indifferent slide. Uyuni appeared as a small cluster of lights at the edge of the salt. The bus stopped at a station where a handful of travelers disembarked. their breath visible in the cold. I had booked a night at a hotel built of salt bricks because the idea felt like a story I wanted to carry. The town smelled of diesel and frying oil and the faint mineral tang of the flats. A driver with a small sign met me and led me to a vehicle that would take me the short distance to the Salt Hotel. The ride across the flats was a motion that made the world feel like a photograph being developed. The ground was a white, patient sheet, and the sky above it was a dome so wide it felt like a promise. The hotel sat like a small, deliberate object on the salt, its walls the pale color of bone. The structure had been built from compressed salt bricks, and the seams between them had the look of a place that had been assembled by hands that knew how to make things last in a landscape that does not forgive carelessness. The owner, a woman named Rosa, met me at the door with a lantern and a smile that made the motion feel like an offering. She spoke Spanish with a cadence that made her words feel like careful stones placed in a wall. "The flats are different at night," she said. "They keep their own time." I told myself I wanted to listen. I told myself I was a traveler who collected quiet places. I told myself that a single night on the salt would be a story worth carrying. I told myself these things as she led me through a narrow corridor whose walls were pale and cool to the touch. The room she showed me was small and simple. A bed with a quilt, a low table, and a window that looked out onto the flats. The lamp on the table was a small old thing with a glass chimney that made the light soft and even. Rosa left the lamp lit and said she would be nearby if I needed anything. "If you wake and the flats look different," she said, "do not be afraid to go outside." Her words were a kind of instruction and a kind of warning. I nodded because nodding is a small, civilized thing to do when someone else offers you a map for a place you have not yet learned to read. She closed the door with a motion that suggested she had left a part of herself in the house and was taking the rest with her. The salt has a way of rearranging scale. In daylight, the flats are a bright, indifferent plane. At night, they become a field of small, patient lights, where the stars seem to have settled into the ground. I sat by the window and watched the horizon, the line between earth and sky so thin it felt like a seam. The lamp's light made the room feel like a small, private chapel. I took a photograph from my pocket, a worn print of my mother taken years before, and set it on the table beside the lamp. I had carried it because travel has a way of making absence feel like a presence. The photograph's edges were softened by handling, and when the lamp's light pooled over it, the image looked like a small, private window. I had expected to sleep. Instead, I found myself awake and alert, as if the salt had a way of keeping attention. The room smelled faintly of mineral and the faint sweetness of the lamp oil. I dressed and stepped outside because the motion felt inevitable. The night air was thin and cold, and the salt under my boots made a faint, yielding sound that the flats registered as motion. The sky above was a dome of stars so dense it felt like a ceiling of glass. The hotel behind me was a pale shape, its windows small and patient. I walked away from the building because the flats had become a question I could not ignore. The salt underfoot had the texture of a crust that gave slightly with each step. The world around me was a field of small, patient reflections. The stars mirrored in the salt, the distant lights of other hotels like patient eyes. I walked until the hotel was a small, patient shape behind me, and the horizon had become a thin line. At some point, the air changed. It was not colder. It was quieter in a way that made my own breathing sound too loud. The stars above seemed to rearrange themselves into patterns that made my chest tighten. I told myself to breathe slowly, to let the rhythm settle. I told myself that I was alone and safe. I told myself that the flats were a place that held memory and that I was a guest. Then I saw a light on the salt, a narrow, steady glow that moved across the surface like a small, deliberate thing. It was not the scattered lights of other hotels. It moved with a purpose that suggested it belonged to someone who knew the flats intimately. I watched it because watching felt like a way to learn. The light drew nearer and then paused at a distance that made my skin tighten. A figure stood beside it, wrapped in a heavy coat. Their face turned away from me, The motion of their shoulders suggested they were holding something. I stepped closer because curiosity is a kind of hunger, and I had come to this place to feed it. The figure did not turn. When I was within a few paces, I saw what they held. A small, shallow bowl with a lamp burning inside it. The lamp's flame was steady and pale, and the bowl was set on a small square of cloth. The figure placed the bowl on the salt and then, with a motion that was careful and deliberate, arranged a small pile of objects beside it. A scrap of paper, a coin, a photograph whose edges were softened by water. The photograph was of a man standing on the flats, his face turned toward the camera. When the figure lifted it, the lamp's light made the image look like a small, private window. The figure spoke a name aloud in a language I did not know. The syllables hung in the air like a small, precise bell. The salt accepted the sound. I asked the figure in Spanish what they were doing. They turned then, and I saw a face that had the kind of lines that come from a life lived in wind and sun. Their eyes were dark and precise. "We leave things," they said in a voice that had the cadence of the place. "We leave them so the flats remember." I told them I had left a photograph on my table. They nodded as if they had expected that. "The flats keep what is given," they said, "but they do not keep it the same." I asked what they meant. They pointed to the photograph in their hand. "Sometimes the salt returns what you leave with a change," they said. "A line, a mark, a small shift. It is not malicious. It is not kind. It is a way of making room." The figure's words rearranged the night. The lamp's light made the salt around us look like a small, patient room. I felt, with a slow, sinking certainty, that the flats had accepted the photograph, and had also accepted something else, a piece of attention. The figure folded the photograph and placed it in their coat. They looked at me with an expression that was not unkind. "You should leave something," they said. "If you came to the flats, you should leave a witness." I walked back to the hotel with the motion of someone who has been given a map that is missing a few lines. The room felt like a small, private chapel when I returned. The lamp on the table was still lit. I took the photograph of my mother and wrapped it in a cloth. I stepped outside again and walked to the place where the figure had left the bowl. The salt accepted my steps as if it had been waiting. I set the photograph beside the bowl and spoke my mother's name aloud. The syllables felt like a small, private offering. The lamp's light made the photograph look like a window. I left the place and walked back to the hotel with the feeling that I had done something that mattered, and that the flats had accepted the motion. In the morning, the sky was a thin, patient blue. The hotel looked like a pale object on a white field. I packed my bag and prepared to leave. Rosa met me at the door with a thermos and a small scrap of paper. She handed it to me without comment. The paper was damp at the edges. When I unfolded it, the handwriting was small and precise. The line was in Spanish and English. "Remember what you leave." I thanked her and stepped into the vehicle that would take me back to town. The flats slid by like a photograph being developed. I held the scrap of paper in my hand and felt the weight of the night in my chest. When I reached my hotel in La Paz, I took the photograph out and held it to the light. The image was the same, but there was a small change. A faint line at the corner of my mother's mouth that had not been there before, a mark that suggested time had moved differently for the picture. Tucked into the back of the photograph was a scrap of paper with a single line written in Spanish and English: "Keep a light." I do not know whether the flats keep what they are given or whether they simply rearrange the way people remember. I only know that when I close my eyes now, I can feel the salt under my boots, the lamp's light like a small sun in the dark, and the way the horizon leaned in as if listening for the next name. I should never have taken the night bus across the Altiplano. I did, and the salt kept a piece of my night. I should never have trusted the carved door that smiled at me from the alley. I say it now because the sentence is a small, steady thing I can hold when the rest of the memory wants to dissolve into the humid air. I am an American who travels to places that keep their own histories like living things, and Stone Town in Zanzibar had been on my list for years. I wanted the narrow lanes and the heavy wooden doors, the way a city can fold centuries into a single threshold. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would not let the place rearrange the pieces of me I had been carrying. I told myself I would leave before the tide of memory rose. The alley where I found the house was a ribbon of shadow between two taller buildings, a place where the sun only visited in thin, polite slivers. The air there smelled of cloves and sea salt, and the faint, sweet tang of dried mango. Lanterns hung from low beams and threw patterned light across the stone, making the ground look like a page of script. The door leaned into the alley like a secret. Its wood was dark and polished by hands that had known how to make things last. The carvings were intricate, vines and stars, and a face whose mouth curved in a way that suggested both welcome and calculation. I had been looking for a place to stay that felt like the town itself, not a hotel that had been pasted onto it. The house belonged to a woman named Amina, who met me at the threshold with a smile that made the motion feel like an offering. She spoke English with a cadence that made her words feel like careful stones placed in a wall. "This house remembers," she said as she led me inside. "It keeps what people leave." Her sentence lodged in my chest like a pebble. I told myself it was a way of saying the house had history, that the walls had been witness to births and deaths and the ordinary business of living. I told myself I was a traveler who collected quiet places. I told myself that a single night in a house that had been built before my grandparents were born would be a story worth carrying. The interior was a series of rooms arranged around a central courtyard. A fig tree grew in the middle, its leaves making a slow, patient rustle when the breeze found them. The floors were cool stone, and the air inside the house had the soft density of a place that had been lived in for generations. Amina showed me to a small room on the second floor. The bed was low, and the quilt smelled faintly of lemon oil. A narrow window looked out over the alley and the roofs beyond. She left a lamp on the bedside table and told me she would be downstairs if I needed anything. "If you wake and the house feels different," she said, "do not be afraid to go to the door." Her words were a kind of instruction and a kind of warning. I nodded because nodding is a small, civilized thing to do when someone else offers a map for a place you have not yet learned to read. She closed the carved door behind her with a motion that suggested she had left a part of herself in the house and was taking the rest with her. Stone Town rearranges attention. The alleys make a map only after you have walked them enough times to know which turns are promises and which are traps. Inside the house, the air had a thickness that made the ordinary feel intimate. I walked the rooms because the motion felt like a way to learn the house's grammar. There were shelves with brass trays and jars of spices, a low table with a stack of photographs, and a small shrine in a corner where a candle had been burned down to a nub. The photographs were black and white and sepia, faces that had been folded into the paper until the edges were soft. I ran my fingers along one frame because I needed to confirm that I was touching something real. The glass was cool, and the image beneath it had the look of a memory that had been handled often. On the landing between the floors there was a door I had not noticed at first. It was narrower than the others and set slightly off the corridor, as if it had been an afterthought. The wood was the same dark grain, but the carving on its face was different. A single eye, open and patient. The latch was a simple iron bar that had been polished by hands. When I touched the metal, it was warm from the day's sun. I asked Amina about the door when she brought me tea. She smiled in a way that made the lines at the corners of her eyes deepen. "That door leads to a room we do not use," she said. "It is old. It is private." I told her I understood and that I would not pry. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, and then she said, "Some doors are like people. They keep their own company. They do not like to be opened without reason." I told myself I would respect the house's privacy. I told myself that curiosity is a kind of hunger, and that I had come to this place to feed it. I told myself these things as I climbed the narrow stairs and stood before the door with the carved eye. When I lifted the iron bar and pushed the door, it did not open into a room so much as into a corridor of light. The space beyond was narrow and lined with shelves, and the air smelled of old paper and the faint sweetness of dried flowers. The corridor led to a small chamber with a single window that looked out over the sea. The room had been arranged with a care that suggested someone had been interrupted. A low table, a chair pulled out as if someone had been sitting there recently, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. On the table lay a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, and on top of the letters was a photograph. The photograph showed a man standing on a beach, his face turned toward the camera. He wore a hat and a coat that suggested a life lived in wind. The back of the photograph had a line written in a hand that trembled slightly. For the one who waits. The line made my chest tighten. I told myself it was a relic, a private thing left by a family member. I told myself the house kept such things because houses are repositories of small, private histories. I set the photograph down and noticed, for the first time, that the chair across from the table bore an indentation in the cushion. The indentation was shallow but precise, as if someone had been sitting there not long ago. The window's glass had a faint film on it, and when I pressed my palm to the pane, I felt the vibration of the sea beyond. The room felt like a place that had been arranged to receive attention. I sat in the chair because I wanted to test the theory. The cushion gave under my weight in a way that confirmed its softness. The letters on the table were tied with a ribbon that had been faded by time. I untied the ribbon and opened the top envelope. The handwriting inside was careful and precise. The letters spoke of waiting and of a promise to return. It spoke of a tide that takes and a tide that gives. The last line read, "Keep the door closed until someone remembers." I read the line 3 times. Each time the words seemed to rearrange themselves, as if the paper were trying to tell me something that language could not hold. I closed the letter and felt a pressure in my chest that was not entirely fear. It was a recognition, a sense that I had stepped into a story that had been waiting for a reader. When I stood, the chair scraped the floor in a way that the room registered as an event. The motion left a faint dust cloud in the beam of light from the window. I moved to the trunk and opened it. Inside were objects: a child's shoe, a length of rope, a small carved whale. Each object had the look of something that had been offered and then accepted. I picked up the whale and felt the grain of the wood under my fingers. The object was warm, as if it had been held recently. I left the room and closed the door behind me, but the house did not let me go in a straight line. The corridors seemed to shift, and the landing where the door had been was not where I remembered it. The carved eye on the door faced a different direction. My phone screen was a pale, useless rectangle when I checked it. The battery icon was a thin line. The map on the screen was a smear. I told myself that old houses have odd geometries, and that my sense of direction had been softened by travel. That night, the house settled into a kind of attention. The fig tree in the courtyard made a slow, patient rustle. The sea beyond the roofs was a dark, patient presence. I lay awake and thought of the photograph and the line on the letter. I told myself I would not return to the room. I told myself that some doors are closed for a reason. At some point, there was a motion at the carved door. It was not a sound that could be named. Instead, the latch moved and the door eased inward as if someone had chosen to open it from the inside. I walked to the landing because the motion felt inevitable. The corridor beyond the door was lit by a thin, patient light that made the dust in the air visible as a slow film. The chair in the chamber was empty. The letters lay where I had left them. The trunk was closed. On the table, where the photograph had been, there was now a small scrap of paper. The handwriting was small and precise. The line was in Swahili and English. "Stay where you are." The sentence made my chest tighten. I told myself it was a note left by Amina or a family member, a practical instruction about safety. I told myself that houses are full of people who leave messages for one another. I told myself these things because they were the only things I could tell myself. I folded the scrap and put it in my pocket because I wanted to carry a piece of the place with me. I walked back to my room and found, on the bedside table, the photograph I had brought with me of my sister. It had been on the table when I arrived. Now it was gone. In its place, tucked under the lamp's base, was a small, damp smear that looked like a fingerprint and a single line written in a hand that trembled slightly. Remember.